Is Islam the root cause of our Western problems with mass immigration? My name is Ronie, a Swedish conservative, and today I am going to talk about that with Mr. Robert Spencer from jihadwatch.org. Welcome. Mr. Robert Spencer, Director of Jihad Watch, welcome.
Thank you. Always happy to be here.
We're going to talk about your latest book, Confession of an Islamophobe. And if we start from the beginning, how did you become so interested in Islam?
Well, I was interested in it because of my family's history. My grandparents were exiled from the Ottoman Empire for declining to convert to Islam. And I was very interested in what had happened to them. They always spoke about how wonderful it was there. And I wondered, well, then how is it that you got exiled? And so the study of that led me into study of Islam. And that, of course, became a matter of geopolitical importance with the Islamic Revolution in Iran and later with 9/11 and so on. So you know how one thing leads to another, and here I am.
Yeah, and in your studies, when you have been studying Islam, you discovered that Islam was quite problematic. And in your book, you warn about why Islam is a threat towards women, gays, Jews, Christian, secular liberals, and secular Muslims. Could you mention some specific examples of that in our society today, of how these threats manifest themselves?
Yes, certainly. Any concern about Islam, as I discuss in the book, is consigned to the realms of bigotry and so-called Islamophobia. But in reality, there's every reason to be concerned about Islam because Islam institutionalizes, for example, oppression of women. The Quran in chapter 4, verse 34 sanctions the beating of disobedient women and denies women the equality of testimony, the equality of inheritance rights. Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, says that hell is mostly filled with women because they are deficient in religion and in intellect. And there's many, many other things that make the life for women under Islamic law very hard. There is also the same kind of thing for Jews who are demonized. It's called the worst enemies of Muslims. And so we have Muslim clerics to this day praying to Allah for the killing of Jews wholesale. And this is something that is called for by Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, when he says that the hour of the end times, the last hour, will not come until Muslims kill Jews. And the Jews will hide behind trees, and the trees will cry out, "Oh, Muslim, there's a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him." It's a fanciful story, but it's essentially giving sanction to the killing of Jews in order to hasten the consummation of all things, the end times. And so these kinds of things are reason for women, for Jews. Also, I could go on and on, for Christians, for gays, for others, that they should be concerned and that it's perfectly reasonable and legitimate to have concerns about Islam. It's not a matter of bigotry and prejudice.
Yeah.
The idea that all of this is some sort of phobia is designed, in fact, to intimidate people into being afraid to call out these aspects of Islam and to oppose them for fear of being tarred as racists and bigots.
Yeah, here in Sweden, we are waking up to the reality of gang rapes, no-go zones, and places where immigrants segregate men and women. And in your book, you give a couple of examples from Sweden, such as the incident in Uppsala in January 2017, when 3 persons, 2 African immigrants, gang raped a woman and live-streamed it on Facebook. For this crime, by the way, the criminal who got the harshest sentence got only 2.5 years in prison. In America, I assume he would be imprisoned for life. But would you as an American say that the American perception of Sweden is changing?
Yes, I think so. Certainly Sweden for years has enjoyed a very good reputation in the United States. I remember when I was in high school learning that Sweden was essentially the best country on earth, that it had a perfect kind of government and it was a very peaceful place and so on. And nowadays people realize that cities such as Malmö and others increasingly are becoming more dangerous, and life there is much more precarious than it was previous to this mass Muslim migration that is transforming Sweden and making it into what is essentially a war zone.
Yeah, like I said, we are beginning to wake up, but the big elephant in the room is still Islam. We don't connect the dots between the criminal behavior among immigrants and the religious background. Would you say how strong actually is the connection between crimes committed by immigrants with Muslim background and Islam itself?
It's about 1-to-1. It's 100%, because the immigrants come and they have contempt for the native Swedes and contempt for Swedish law, because the Quran says to Muslims, you are the best of people, enjoining what is right and forbidding what is wrong, the best of people on earth. That's chapter 3, verse 110 of the Quran. And that means that as long as they enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong, they're actually superior to non-Muslims, who are the most vile of created beings, also according to the Quran, chapter 98, verse 6. So if you're coming to the land of people who are vile and who don't know what's right and wrong, then you're certainly not going to have any respect for their laws. And when the Quran says that women should cover themselves so that they're not molested, with the implication, therefore, being that if they are not covered, then they can legitimately be molested, and that infidel women, non-Muslim women, can be taken as captives of the right hand, according to the Quran, that is essentially sex slaves, then you're going to come to a country that is full of uncovered women who are not Muslims. You're not going to have respect for them, and you are going to think that raping them and committing crimes against these vile people is something that is entirely justified. The belief system is what gives rise to all this kind of behavior, and yet that is the one thing that Swedish authorities, just like American authorities and authorities all over the rest of Europe, they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to address it. And so as a result, because they will not address or cannot address the root causes, these behaviors continue.
Yeah, but a lot of these criminals aren't, active Muslims. Can you still trace it to Islam, even though they are not practicing?
Certainly.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Because these attitudes that I'm describing in brief are very deeply ingrained, and they're part of Islamic culture. You don't have to be a devout Muslim to pick them up. I can note, for example, Bosch Falston. Bosch Falston is a professional cartoonist who is the winner of our Muhammad Art Exhibit and Cartoon Contest in Garland, Texas in 2015 for his cartoon of Muhammad. And Bosch Falston is an ex-Muslim. He grew up in a Muslim household. And he gave a speech that night at that event, which was attacked by Jihad terrorists. He said that he grew up in a secular Muslim household. They were not religious, they were not observant, but they were aware of themselves as Muslims. And he said that the contempt that he and everyone around him, all the people he knew, all the other Muslims that he knew in the area where he grew up, they all hated Jews, and they all had contempt for women. These attitudes did not confine themselves to those who were devout and knowledgeable. They were just general in the Islamic community.
Very interesting. These things are very important to recognize, but a lot of people who try to warn about these things, like yourself, you get labeled as, racist and xenophobes, and you talk about that. That's actually what your book is about. So could you tell me how has this label been used against you?
Well, certainly. The whole idea is, according to the rules for radicals of Saul Alinsky, the 20th century communist theorist, he said that you freeze the target, isolate it, marginalize it, personalize it, and cut it off. And what that essentially means is that what the left does is they zero in on someone, as they zeroed in on me. They act as if what I'm saying is completely egregious and is original to myself, not that as if I'm the one who wrote the Quran or I'm the one who conjured up the sayings of Muhammad. They don't acknowledge that these things actually have any basis within actual Islam. They act as if it all comes from me, and these are egregious, horrible things to say. That is freezing, isolating, targeting, personalizing the target, and then making it so that the person in question, the target, is so toxic that nobody will deal with him. And this has certainly been my case, my experience, and that of many others who speak the truth about these issues. We are smeared as racists, bigots, Islamophobes, and so on. And then people who are not informed about these issues and not informed about this very kind of name-calling as a tactic are afraid to deal with us personally or to deal with the issues that got us labeled in this way. And consequently, they don't discuss these problems, and they're afraid to discuss them for fear of being likewise labeled.
Yeah.
So this is ultimately the goal of these Alinskyite tactics, to make people intimidated into thinking that they cannot say anything about jihad terrorism. They can't say anything about how jihadis justify their violent actions on the basis of Islamic teaching, because if they do, then they will be targeted in the same way.
Yeah, and you have actually a theory in your book about why they do this, and you write that the modern man can't, it's the modern man is unable to imagine that anyone actually can believe the things that the Islamists believe, and therefore those who talk about the craziness of Islam must be making it up, and therefore they must be Islamophobic.
Yes, exactly. That most modern liberals in the world, all around Europe and North America, tend to think that we're beyond all this. We're beyond religious sectarianism. We're beyond war. All we need to do is sit down and talk it out, and we'll come to some agreement. And they assume that the rest of the world is like that as well. And so people who are saying, no, these people are implacable and violent and absolutists and expansionists, they think, well, it must be our fault for saying that, because they really couldn't be that way. There are no more people that way in the modern world. It's naive and stupid, but it is the prevailing view.
Yeah, we actually have an example of this right now here in Sweden. We had last year, there was this terror attack at Drottninggatan in Stockholm where 5 people were killed. And this was the first successful jihadi attack on Swedish soil in history. And the terrorist, Rashmat Akilov, he said that he wanted to fight for the caliphate and go to paradise. And one of the trial lawyers said that this man knows nothing about Islam. And a left-wing academic said the same, that this guy does not even know the 5 pillars of Islam, because this terrorist had said that he believed that jihad was one of the 5 pillars, and this academic took the opportunity to say he knows nothing about Islam. He is totally wrong. So you have an example there.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's quite common, though. I've seen it over the years. So many non-Muslim judges lecturing the convicted terrorists from their in court, that is, about what Islam is all about, and saying this says what you're doing has nothing to do with Islam, and you're twisting your own religion. It's ridiculous, these non-Muslim judges lecturing Muslims about the nature of Islam, but it happens quite frequently.
Yeah. Another problem, I would say, is the total resignation of Christianity when it comes to these issues. I'm an evangelical Christian myself, and most of my evangelical friends here in Sweden are all into this idea of helping other people, and therefore believes that open borders and mass immigration is a good thing, or at least we can't condemn those who want to come here. And the Catholic Church used to have a much more clearer insight, but I would say that Pope Francis is quite, well, he's not that clear on these issues. Do you have any thoughts about that? Because I know that you are a practicing Catholic. Do you think Christianity eventually will wake up?
That's a good question. I don't think that I don't think anybody's going to wake up at this point. Actually, I'm sorry to say. I think that the lines are drawn. There are certain people who think, yes, there's a problem with Islam, but they're very much in the minority, and the majority thinks that that the only problem is with people who are a tiny minority of Muslim extremists, and they're extremists in all faiths, and they are acting out a twisted, hijacked version of Islam. The Pope thinks that. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops thinks that. I don't think any number of terror attacks or anything of that kind is going to change that. The people have made up their minds at this point, and I don't think any amount of evidence is going to disconfirm the conclusions that they've come to. It's a shame because certainly over the centuries, the Church fought against jihad terror and did everything that they could to keep the jihadis from advancing in Europe. But now the Pope and the Catholic Church, they're the chief enablers of the advance of jihad in Europe.
Yeah, that's very tragic. But I remember Pope Benedict XVI, and he held this speech in Regensburg in 2006, where he talked about that God is rational and violence is incompatible with the nature of God. And I think that was a good example of that you actually can, confront with Christian theology these Islamic radical ideas, if you want to.
Yes, that was very good. But since then, Pope Francis has completely turned around the Church, and not only that, but there's a certain kind of idolatry of the papacy within the Catholic Church. The idea of the Pope's infallibility is something that's actually quite circumscribed in actual Catholic theology, but de facto, the Roman Catholic Church treats the Pope as if he were some sort of divine oracle, such that every one of his words is the word of God. And I've run up against this myself. I actually had a debate with a Catholic Monsignor last year or a couple of years ago, who was insisting that because Pope Francis and the Second Vatican Council and so on said that that Islam was a religion of peace, that therefore all Catholics had to obey this and believe this. And I thought, well, if that's the case, then I'm a heretic, and I certainly can't go along with something that's obviously false in that way. But because the Pope says it, all too many Catholics think this is what they ought to believe, and they are doing a grave disservice to Christians, not just to Catholics, by pretending that this is the case, by abandoning the persecuted Christians of the Middle East to their fate, by persecuting and trying to silence those who have called attention to the persecution of Christians and to the fact that it's based on Islamic teachings. Really, if free people survive into future centuries, and there's a history written of the 21st century and the capitulation to the Islamic Jihad, the Catholic Church will stand as one of the primary culprits.
Yeah. Last question, our final question. During World War II, Winston Churchill talked about that the battle against Hitler was a battle for Christian civilization. Would you say that the confrontation with Islam, militant Islam today, not with individual Muslims, but with Islam, is our generation's great battle for Christian and Western civilization?
Yes, sure. No doubt about that. And of course, one of the big problems is that the West has largely given up Christianity and doesn't have anything to replace it. Nature abhors a vacuum. And for all too many people, you can see the converts to Islam who have become jihad leaders from the United States, from Britain, from all over Europe. Islam is filling that vacuum to a tremendous degree. And the West is going to be paying a price for that for quite some time to come.
Can we win this confrontation, this battle with these ideas?
I would never say that we cannot until it's over. It's not over. And so I'm going to keep fighting, certainly to my dying breath. And I hope that other free people will as well.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, anyway, thanks a lot for taking time, Robert Spencer. Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure.